Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University. Today's workshop, Edition Exhibition Writing Archival Material, has been organised by the department in association with Errant. Errant is a student journal of post-criticism or critical creative writing, run by 3 PhD students in the department. We're on Facebook and Twitter at Errant Lancaster, and you can find our website on errantlancaster.wordpress.com, and I'll put some links in the chat for you as well. I will say a little bit more about Errant at the end of the session, but for now I think we should just get to what we're all here for today. So I will talk a little bit more about Dr. Mathelinda Nabugodi in a moment, who's running today's workshop. But I thought it would be good if we could just run through introducing ourselves very briefly. So just your name and what you do is absolutely fine. And then we can get started. So John, if you'd like to start by introducing yourself.
Hi, yeah, I'm John, and I teach mainly 20th century and, if you like, post-criticism or critical creative.
Thank you, John. James?
Hi, I'm a PhD student of John's, and I'm writing a creative critical thesis on Jean Rhys and Hope Merleys, and I'm also one of the editors of Errant.
Excellent, thank you. Ellen?
Hi, I'm a lecturer in creative writing at Lancaster. I'm going to keep my mic off quite a lot because I have a dog that barks a lot.
Sure, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you. Jo?
Hello, so my name's Jo Carruthers and I'm a lecturer in the department, and I've recently edited a creative critical set of essays called Sandscapes. That's landscapes with an S, about sand.
Excellent, thank you. Julie?
Sure. Hello, I'm a MA creative writing student part-time. I live in the North Lakes, and I write mainly poetry and non-fiction. Yeah, that's me.
Excellent, thank you. Kat?
Hi, I'm Kat. I'm a second year undergrad in English Literature and Creative Writing.
Excellent, thank you. Samia?
Hello, my name is Samia. I am editor at Errant and also a PhD student of John's, currently researching the presence of Islam in Catherine Mansfield. Very excited for today.
Excellent, thank you. And last but certainly not least, Sharon?
Hello, I'm Sharon Muston. I'm the head of department at the moment, but usually I'm a romanticist and particularly a Percy Bysshe Shelleyan, so I'm very excited about this.
Excellent, thank you. I say last but not least, but I should introduce myself as well, shouldn't I? So last and least, my name is Matthew. I'm a PhD student of John's, currently producing a post-critical thesis on the works of Maurice Blanchot, Samuel Beckett and Emmanuel Levinas, and I'm also co-founder and editor of Errant. So now then, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mathelinda Nabugodi. Mathelinda is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at Newnham College, University of Cambridge. She was the first to earn a PhD in creative critical writing from UCL and has contributed to the editing of the 5th volume of the poems of Shelley in the Longman Annotated English Poems series. Mathelinda is currently creating and defining a creative critical edition of Percy Shelley's notebooks and approaches the works of Shelley and his circle with an eye on translation and foreign language learning. Questions of self-reflexive literary criticism and what it means for a woman of colour to study the works of a long-dead white man also inform Mathelinda's work. In light of what follows, I should also say that Mathelinda is drawn to the various objects preserved in the Shelley archives. So, Mathelinda, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Matthew, and thank you all of you for coming. I'm very excited that you're here, despite Zoom fatigue and despite kind of being quite late in the term, to see me, and so I really look forward to today. So the way I'll do this is I'll first read out some recent work, so it'll be like a bit of reading, roughly 15-20 minutes, and then there'll be a bit of looking at some archive materials that I put online, and then there'll be a bit of writing. And at the end, there'll be a bit of discussion about the experience of the workshop. Not that I'll ask you to read anything you've written. It's more to reflect about sort of the act of writing and the act of writing in this format together, but also in response to certain archival things. So yeah, without further ado, I'll get going. Yes. Yeah, hopefully y'all see another slide now. Yeah. So, in 1996, Jacques Derrida published the book you see on the slide, Archive Fever, which contributed to causing an archive fever among critics. Yet while archive is resonant as a metaphor on many levels, it's a site of origin, thinking of its etymology in the word arche. It is a location of memory. It is the coalface where heritage is constructed. Yet I find that there's often a gap between theorizing archives and working in archives. It's not just that the kind of person who does archival research often has little patience with theoretical ornamentation, but that in many ways archives are mundane. The materials are stored in sober, acid-free boxes. They're consulted under highly regimented conditions. So in short, archival research is often quite boring in and of itself. One sits there, immobile, hunched over some old, often foul-smelling manuscript, strained eyes, strained back, strained mind, fingers and toes numb with cold because it's always freezing in an archive. I began doing archival research as part of the edition of Percy Bysshe Shelley's translations for the Longman Shelley edition, so the Poems of Shelley, Volume 5. My task was to establish reading texts based on his notebooks, so the text in his notebooks, as opposed to early published editions. The reason being that these texts were first published after his death. So the idea was to go back to his drafts rather than later edited texts, with interference by editors after his death. But in working on the Shelley edition, I was really often frustrated with how much is left behind when we do edit a text. So we take the words and ignore everything else. The smells, the textures, the stains, the accidents, the doodles. So there's very much about a notebook that is left in the archive, but also the whole experience of being in an archive and working with it. So I was wondering, can we edit the experience of working in an archive rather than the poems, just the text or just the words? And if we do edit our experience of material objects, how do we exhibit it? In a book, as a web page, as an installation? These are the questions that are supposed to guide my research. But somehow the research refuses to take shape. In part because COVID has, of course, put an end to all archival research for the moment. Instead, it's me stuck at home with only my memories for company. The archive is a site of memory, of course, yet lockdown has turned our own homes into a kind of parody of the archive, where we are silent, secluded, and there's a kind of dusty feeling to it all. So today I will not talk so much about archive theory, which was maybe my intention when I first signed up to do this talk. Instead, I will share some of the material that I've been writing recently while not working in archives. And in a way, it is inspired by creative critical writing, and especially the movement towards author theory. So attempts to center our own personal experience and our own history in the work that we do. So above all, I want to reflect on how it is that given all the things I could have become, I ended up becoming a literary critic, forever complaining about the conventions of literary criticism, and hence the creative critical in my work. So in a way, it's a sort of my reflection on creative criticism and the limits of conventional criticism, and I hope that that will be kind of a basis for our discussion later on, so something you might be able to, or something you have thought about as well. So the first part of my talk proper, entitled Poetry. How is a poem created? Our word for poetry is derived from the Greek poiesis, meaning to make, a conception that still resonates in the Scottish word for poet, for instance, makar. For many centuries, poetic creation was a skill in how to make things with words. But our understanding of creation changed in the Romantic period, which is the period that I specialize in as a scholar of English literature. The Romantics transformed our idea of creation from being a question of craftsmanship to becoming a question of genius. The poet, the genius par excellence, expresses his inner soul through his words, and his inner soul is the mirror of the human soul at large. Caspar David's Critic's painting, which you should be seeing on your screen now, is one of the most famous representations of romantic man. Although scholars in recent decades have begun to move beyond that notion of romanticism that was kind of tied to the big six poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, and Keats, and Blake as well, my sense is that the Friedrich's Wanderer remains a key figure in how we imagine romanticism. Next. A confession. In my teens, I fancied myself a bit of a poet, which is why I started studying English at Edinburgh University, and that you see me kind of at the time when I started. But I'd also internalized the very romantic idea of poetry, hence my posturing that image. Above all, I associated poetry with someone like Lord Byron, wide shirt, bold stride, red wine, and inscrutable eyes. Lady Caroline Lamb, one of Byron's mistresses, famously characterized him, and I quote, as mad, bad, and dangerous to know, end quote. This struck me as a very accurate job description for a poetic genius. Going to university killed my poetic aspirations, not so much because being a Black woman I could never live up to the Byronic ideal, but because I got hooked on criticism. I do think that as critics we are a bit snobbish about poets. Although we dedicate our careers to their compositions, we also look down on them, regarding them as geniuses who write compulsively, drunkenly, intuitively, sort of like inspired idiots who don't really know what they're about, which is a phrase used about Shelley by one of his critics. On contrast, we critics, we are sober, we are disciplined, we can analyze, interpret, dissect their bodies of work with our scalpel minds. But even within the confines of the academy, and despite the homogenizing force of academic prose, not all critics are equal. When I came to Romanticism, I saw it as associated with a heady mixture of obscure German philosophy, navel-gazing idealism, and radical politics. A child of the French Revolution, when man had freed himself both politically and mentally from the shackles of tradition, religion, and monarchy. The idea of epochal change was complemented by a penchant for self-reflection, thinking about thinking, writing poetry about the writing of poetry. So Romanticism seemed to me as a literary historical moment that was uniquely obsessed with its own status as a herald of a liberated future. Romantic poetry is both prophetic, it anticipates the future, and self-reflective. It is concerned with telling the story of its own creation. As an example of that tendency, I'll give you a poem by John Keats. So I'll start by reading it out. This living hand, now warm and capable, of earnest grasping would, if it were cold, and in the icy silence of the tomb, so haunt thy days and chill thy dreaming nights, that thou would wish thine own heart dry of blood, so in my veins red life might stream again, and though be conscious calmed, see here it is, I hold it towards you. The hand that is held towards the reader in the closing line is both this, that is Keats's, living hand, as well as his poem describing this living hand. In this gesture, Keats juxtaposes the blood pulsing through his veins with the ink pulsing through his pen. And even as he anticipates that the former will end up stilled in the icy silence of the tomb, he remains assured that his poetry's lifeblood will remain ever warm and capable of grasping his reader's heartstrings. This short poem is staking out the primacy of poetic over biological life, and it does so by self-reflectively representing the poet's own living hand in the moment of writing the poem. So how do we as critics take this proffered hand? Keats himself has been dead and buried some 200 years. In fact, the bicentenary of his death was just a few weeks ago. So what of his prophecy that we would wish our own hearts dry of blood in order that he may live again? In a certain sense, that's precisely what we are doing here, sacrificing waking hours to reading, writing about, and teaching Keats's poetry, and in so doing contributing to his afterlife. The time that I've spent talking, and you have spent listening to me talking about this poem, is a chunk of our lives that has been claimed by Keats's living hand, and that we will never get it, so that we will never get it back. That said, such an interpretation of the poem reads it on its own terms. It accepts the analogy set up between Keats's own hand and the poem he wrote with his hand, as well as the anticipated compact between dead poet and living reader. In other words, I have only explicated and repackaged ideas already contained in the poem. Is this the purpose of criticism? To explicate in prose something that has been much more beautifully expressed in verse? And what does it say about my critical ability if all I do is incorporate wholesale the ideas of those poems whom I'm supposed to criticize? What is the act of criticism, then? Next slide I call the critic. By the time, to address the question of what is an act of criticism, by the time I entered university, the theory wars, which I think addressed that question quite vehemently in the 90s, they were fading away. But I perceived the residue in a clear distinction between the somewhat banal neo-historicists, who are into historical facts, and then the impenetrable and therefore clearly very clever literary theorists. The paragon of the latter was Jacques Derrida, whom you see on the photograph there, the author of Archive Fever, above mentioned. But my own department included some lesser names striking a very similar pose. I'd like to suggest that this is a decidedly post-romantic, post-poetic figure, characterized by a black shirt, bold thought, red wine, and inscrutable words. For me personally, this intellectual heritage meant that I could get through a decade's worth of university education without questioning the association between poetry, philosophy, and white manhood. Indeed, as a critic interested in literary form and poetics, I deliberately turned away from overtly political kinds of interpretation, such as feminist or postcolonial readings. To me, that kind of criticism seemed to be problematically obsessed with the author's identity and other factors outside of the text. Now, There's Nothing Outside of the Text is a soundbite from Derrida that acted as a shibboleth to the first semester introductory module in literary theory and criticism. Another pair of key concepts in that module, and definitely in my character formation as a literary critic, were defamiliarization from the Russian formalist Ostranenye and depersonalization from T.S. Eliot. So here I'll quote Eliot for you. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. End quote. Accordingly, I began to understand creation, as well as criticism, as the extinction of all personal elements, defamiliarized, depersonalized. This aligned very well with the aims of academic writing as it was taught to me. Writing was supposed to be objective, disembodied, rational. No one cares about my opinions. It's about arguments. So that's, at least when I think back about it, I feel that's how I was taught to write as an undergraduate. Yet I cannot say that I was ever fully satisfied with this kind of barren formalism, even as I really admired it intellectually. And it is intellectually rigorous for sure, but it also causes a kind of cerebral rigor mortis, that is the stiffness that besets a corpse a few hours after death. It has taken me an embarrassingly long time to understand that who we are matters. I might be an expert on dead white poets, but my experience as a woman of color affects my relationship to their writing. This is not to say that I claim to speak on behalf of all women of color, like maybe the Romantics claim to speak on behalf of all of humanity, but my aim is to be honest about the personal elements of my involvement with Romanticism. Reading Romantic poetry and touching objects once owned by the Romantics triggers certain memories, and these memories are an important part of my interpretation. Next section. My opening question, how was a poem created, was in fact a veiled citation from an essay by George Agamben in his book The Fire and the Tale. The essay is called What is the Act of Creation? Agamben's attempt to answer the question starts with Aristotle's distinction between potentiality and actuality. Broadly speaking, and this is very broadly speaking, Agamben defines creation, or I should rather say, for Aristotle, creation is the passage from potentiality into actuality. Agamben alights on the potentiality, and he notes that, for instance, if I'm an architect, I possess the potentiality to build a house, and I can actualize the potentiality by building a house. Yet I can also choose not to build a house. So alongside the potentiality to create is a potentiality not to create. Creation, Agamben argues, plays out in a dynamic interaction between these two potentialities, the potentiality to create and the potentiality not to create. Agamben connects the potentiality to with genius, and in this respect it's very romantic what he says, and the potentiality not to is the individual artist's reticence or resistance to the force of his own genius. I would like to be a bit more prosaic and suggest that the potentiality not to is not necessarily our personal resistance as much as caused by factors in our environment. So not doing something could be sheer laziness and resistance, but it could also be other things that prevent us from realizing our potential. And I'm thinking about things like structural discrimination on account of race, gender, ethnicity, ability, and other characteristics. In creating something, we're both actualizing our potential to create it and overcoming the many reasons we have not to create. Regardless of how much we might strive for impersonal objectivity, the nature of the obstacles we face will contribute to shaping whatever it is we create. And that's why who we are matters. It would always leave an imprint on whatever we create. Well, that's what I think. What Agamben says is this. He cites Dante to talk about, well, he calls in this quote, the amphibious character of poetic creation, that is the dynamic between potentiality to and potentiality not to. He summarizes it in a verse from the Divine Comedy. The artist who for the habit of art has a hand that trembles. So it trembles with these two opposing potentialities. To this, I'd like to add that not only the artist, but also the critic has a trembling hand. Every critical interpretation arises out of the interplay between certain potential meanings in the text and the actual context in which the critic is reading it. That's why it is never a question of a definitive reading, because the emergence of new ideas over time and new contexts in which we read texts necessitates us to return to canonical texts again and again. To give you an example, our own moment's growing scientific understanding of climate breakdown and deepened insight into race complicates our reading of a canonical classic such as Shakespeare's The Tempest, whose action hinges on both an environmental calamity, that is the tempest, and the forced labor of both Caliban as well as Ariel. Characters who are racialized in very radically opposing ways, the dark and earthy Caliban, the light and airy Ariel, yet both are enslaved to Prospero. Such an environmentally and racially attuned reading activates a potentiality that was always there in Shakespeare's play, but that it has perhaps not yet been actualized in this particular way by previous criticism because it was read at different points in time. In this regard, we're much better off regarding literary texts as limitless potentialities whose meaning can never be permanently fixed. Any critical interpretation trembles, suspended between the many possible ways of reading a text. Now, finally, this is my last slide. Just as importantly as the trembling hand of the artist or the critic, the trembling is also a physical thing in the archive. And I'm thinking of my own hands, although stupidly, the photograph is actually not one of my hands, but belongs to Catherine White. And the manuscript she's looking at is Jane Austen's fair copy of her story, The Watsons. Nonetheless, although I'm not showing you my own hand, I'm thinking of my own hands that are so often trembling while handling the precious materials we find in archives, particularly paper, which is so thin and so easy to rip. And we'll look at some of the materials in a second as well. So the archives contain the physical remains of poetic creation, the humble materials that make the writing of poetry possible, pieces of paper, notebooks, and homemade booklets like the one you're looking at the moment. But they also contain other objects that were part of the everyday lives of the Romantic authors, or any authors represented in the archive. But in the case of the Romantic poets, you have things like Wordsworth's teacup, or Shelley's glove, or Mary Shelley's mirror, as well as unusual things such as a baby rattle made of coral and gold, which belonged to Percy Shelley. And that's an object that I'm kind of obsessed by, so I'll show it to you in a second. And dwelling on these objects is material things that are part of literary archives, but actually not literary artifacts, but really what used to be, well, household objects or else clutter. I also want to pay homage to the many invisible hands whose labor made the creation of poetry possible. So in the Romantic era, paper was primarily made from rags rather than wood, as that's a later invention. So you start with the rag pickers. Actually, start with people who made the fabric, the original fabric. Then rag pickers are collecting it. Then paper makers are pulping it and creating paper. Of course, you have the quills, which are made of goose feathers. So you have people who are plucking those feathers and preparing them. You have the ink, the various natural materials that need to be collected and processed. So I wonder whether there's a way to build a haptic relation to the people who once prepared these objects, so the material elements of the literary archive, whose own names are, of course, often lost to history. And here we sort of enter the realm of really imagination and speculation, and this is why I will end my talk at this moment. But I'm interested in how, as well as the kind of relations we can establish with objects in the archive that go beyond the extraction of texts, but try and think about it more in haptical terms and more in embodied terms. Okay, so this is the end of my talk. What I want to do now is we'll go to a website called the Padlet, and I'll put the link in the chat. Sophisticated technology here. How do I open? Oh, here it is. Sorry. So yes, the link is there, or you can access it via the chat. So if you open this web page, clicking on the link, what you'll see is a pinboard with photographs most of these objects photographed here come from the archives of Romantic poets, and that I have come across in the course of my research. In a way, as a literary critic in terms of my disciplinary training, I don't really know what to do about these things. So say Mary Shelley's dressing case, for instance. It doesn't help me to interpret her novel Frankenstein, or indeed any other of her writings. On the contrary, I think from my critical point of view, these things are a bit erratic, they're a bit kitschy, they're a bit unscientific, they have a whiff of pseudo about them, sort of astrology, phrenology, and the like. It's not real science that deals with these kind of objects. Which is why the only way that we can engage with them, from what I see at least, is creatively, or creative critically, or indeed post-critically. And which is where the second half of the workshop comes in, which will be a writing exercise in the archive. But also, one thing I'm interested in is the distance between us and these objects, between us and the authors on the one hand, but then also between us and these objects as things we can actually touch in the world. And that's why I wanted to start this exercise by inviting all of you to add an object to the archive. And in this way, to try to break down the distance, the boundary between the objects belonging to the Romantics and our own personal clutter. Not least because placing those things alongside one another, I think, transgresses the boundary between archive and outside the archive, but is a way to make it visible as well and think about it more explicitly. And I hope we'll do that in the discussion later on. So in a way that I tried to do by placing a photograph of myself next to a photograph of Critic's Wanderer painting earlier on, a few slides ago. So let's take a 5-minute break. I'd suggest look at the objects in the Padlet and think about things you could potentially add to it. Now, the way to go about it is fairly simple. If you just take a walk around your room, stretch your legs, but also find an object you would like to contribute, photograph it, and transfer it to your computer. And then once you're on the Padlet, anyone can edit this page. So the way to do it is to click on in the bottom right corner, there's a plus with a pink circle with a plus in it. If you click on that, a new post will appear in the top left corner. And then you can either write something or you can upload something. And there's a little arrow. If you click that, you'll be able to browse your computer and upload as usual. So now the time is past. So if we reconvene at 35. So in the meanwhile, if you can manage to upload something, that would be brilliant. I'd also want to add, I don't want this to be sort of, if the technology doesn't work, it doesn't work. And then we can skip that and don't worry, we have some materials already there. So yeah, give it your best shot. And if it doesn't work, don't worry. And we'll just kind of work with what's there. Cool. Was that clear? Shall I repeat anything? Thanks.
So any kind of object that we like from our room?
Yes. Ideally something personal, so it says something about you, but then also not that personal, you wouldn't want to share it.
Okay.
I don't think it automatically won't say whose is what, and there will be no show and tell, so you won't have to identify what you put there. But just thinking also about that, what it means to transfer something from your surroundings and into that archive space. Great, so it's been 5 minutes. So now we've created a communal archive. That's how easy it is. So can you hear me? And in a way, an archive is no more than that. It's just things that you put together and call them an archive, which is, I think, quite, I suppose, that dignity that the word archive bestows, the way in which when something is part of an archive, it means that it's worth preserving. It's part of, people put money into preserving it. And it's part of a family heritage, national heritage, even world heritage, as some archives are seen as being part of world heritage. But at the same time, at its origin, it's often quite mundane objects. And I think that's partially why I wanted to, or probably the main reason why I wanted you to upload something from whatever's around you. Because of course, most of the things we find in archives were once just stuff around you. Now, what I'd like us to do is use these objects we have there in our communal archive as the basis of a creative critical writing exercise. The way I thought about it is that if you imagine one of these objects that you're holding it in your hand, and then if you begin by describing it. So first of all, the object. So what is it? Where is it from? Where is it located? Where has it been? Potentially, where is it going? But also kind of zooming out a little bit and thinking about the you who's holding it. Not necessarily you yourself, but who is the person who has held this object? When does it happen? Where does it happen? It doesn't need to be in an archive, in this archive. It could be also somewhere else. Where it was before the archive, if it has been stolen from the archive. So try to kind of not worry so much about the factual accuracy, but more about the kind of imaginative engagement with this object as an object. Now, of course, it's very frustrating that this is happening on screen as well. So there's something about that move between looking at images of objects on a flat screen and then thinking about them as objects, which I find very dissatisfactory. And of course, I'd rather do this with actual things in the room. So in a way, part of the question I would like us to think about is, in writing about something we see two-dimensionally, is it possible to create a more than visual relation? Like, can words help us move beyond the two-dimensionality of the screen in a way? And I hope the answer to that is yes. But so the question is maybe not can words help us, but in what ways can words help us move beyond the two-dimensionality of a screen and into a more thick, beyond visual relationship to things. So I think I would like for us to take, I think we have time, say 10 to 15 minutes to write. And here are some prompts on the screen. So I think a question just asked. And then at the end, I don't want you to read what you've written, but I want you to reflect on together in a discussion in a kind of Q&A form about what it feels like to write about objects in this way. So kind of more thinking about what the writing experience as a kind of doing, knowing by doing thing is. And I suppose we could switch off our cameras for this and then reconvene at 10 to. That will give us 10 minutes. Oh, hi, John. Hi, Matthew. Okay, good. So people are still around. For a second, it felt like everyone had departed. Shall I maybe stop sharing the screen so it's easier to have a conversation? Yes, wonderful. So now we have 10 minutes left, and I suppose if you have any questions on what I've been saying, any questions or comments, are very welcome, or just have a more general conversation about the meaning of archives, the meaning of criticism, your relationship to, I suppose, criticism, or to the authors whose work you're criticizing, kind of thinking about what I've been saying about my struggle with romanticism. And also some of your creative writers, that's again, it's like a different configuration. So that would be really interesting to hear your thoughts. So about, do you find critics being snobbish and dismissive of creative writing? Maybe that's kind of different perspective there.
If you want to jump in, Ellen, do feel free.
I wasn't sure how we were going to do it, so I thought I would follow school rules. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. I actually just want to say thank you really for making me take 10 minutes out of my day to write something that didn't feel particularly work oriented, so it was really great. And I'm a creative writer, so that is the sort of thing that I do quite often as a kind of to encourage sensory writing and to encourage kind of concrete writing from students, and it isn't something I do very often myself, so it's a good exercise. And I found myself just being very, I did the Ostrogoth brooch, and I found myself really struggling for everything I could remember about Ostrogoths, which turned out to be just 10 minutes worth, so perfect. That's my contribution.
I'm so glad to hear that, yeah, the simple act of taking a bit of time to write is something we just don't take often enough. As we spoke briefly to John and Matthew yesterday about today's workshop, and they're saying how it was, on the contrary, quite an alienating thing to be forced to write together. And I think that's an area where we maybe have a disciplinary boundary between, or like within the department, quite often between creative writers and the kind of critical section. And John, how did you find writing today when you actually did it?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, not scary in the sense that we're not required to show it. But yeah, unique in the sense of unique experience in the sense that I don't think I've ever made, maybe once, I think ever really just made myself write about an object. Yeah, and particularly challenging, I guess, was the question, what's it made of? Oh, who made it? Yeah, which is when I confessed to myself as I wrote. Yeah, that never occurred to me.
I find it really helpful, the talk generally, but thinking about archival things, just because obviously we've got, as you mentioned at the beginning, because we've been not able to go to archives or anything, and I only started my PhD last year. It's really interesting to think about archival materials in a different way, having not had that opportunity as much to get out there and interact with archival materials as much as we would have done in the last year or so. So that was, I thought, really helpful and really interesting to think about them in a different way.
Yeah, and I thought your idea about the domestic space becoming a parody of the archive was a very interesting one. Sorry.
Especially now that many libraries are putting up stuff digitally and seeing it as a almost valid replacement for in-person visits. I think Julie, have your hand up?
Yeah, I wrote about an object that is very important to me, but it did give me a great deal of intimacy. Even the writing, it brought even a stronger feeling of intimacy with that object than I had before, and it made me think about, and your whole talk, which was really great, thank you, made me think about how things don't just exist in the past. You know, that time is funny that way. That what we write, everything has a life that goes on and on and on. I think embodied by the Keats kind of hand, you know, and definitely got a strong sense of that. Yeah, the life of objects and indeed the life of people and the life of work. Once it's created, it never kind of goes away, I guess, really. And lives on, and also grows, and it has a creative process within itself. That the whole creative process of what it's doing in our brains now, even though it was written 200 years ago, it's that life of the work. It really put me in touch with that.
I was really thinking about the curation of it as well. So I imagined that the brooch that I wrote about was called an Ostrogoth eagle brooch on the label, and someone had decided to call it that when it looks an awful lot like a pigeon. And so to me, I was thinking about, you know, who's looking after the objects and what decisions do they make, and the kind of semiotics of their language around identifying and labeling things that we accept. You know, it's kind of like a telephone game that's just been passed on down to us, that we accept previous interpretations very easily, and we don't necessarily have to. So that was really interesting.
That is the odd house, which is the only object that's not related to any romantic artist. But also I think the archival labeling is so interesting because there's a certain tone to it in its attempt to be objective that can sometimes almost verge into absurdist. But the question of whether that is the best way of describing objects, again, you can approaches on them or not. Thank you also very much for your thoughts earlier, Julie. I think that was really beautiful. And it's such a pleasure for me to hear that those kind of thoughts resonate for other people as well. So I'm not alone in this. But particularly that sense of when you read something old, like the mental process that's happening in your mind is what happened in someone else's mind many years ago. That's right. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments, or shall we wrap up?
Matt, yeah. I guess so. Yeah. Please feel free to do that in any way you feel appropriate.
Yeah, unless anyone else has any kind of closing thoughts, I suppose I could offer one of my own. I learned from scrolling through Twitter this morning that on this day in 1923, James Joyce started writing what would end up being Finnegan's Wake. So perhaps someone in here today has written the germ of the 21st century's answer to Joyce's unreadable masterpiece. But with that, I'll say thank you very much to Mathelinda for offering her time to be here with us today. And indeed, thank you all for attending, and indeed those who had to rush off to other meetings. Just a quick word about Errant. The first full issue of the journal is due to be published, we anticipate, in the summer term, so May or June this year. Submission window is closing today, so James, Samir and I will start looking through the submissions. I've had a little peek, there's a lot of really good stuff in there, so I'm looking forward to seeing that come to fruition and sharing the possibilities of what criticism can be. And I think with that, we can all say adieu for now.
Well, thank you very much for coming and for engaging.
Thank you. Thank you very much.